Yeah, it's I think it's functioning on this side, but I do have to warn you in advance. I'm trying something very unusual with these phone calls. With this phone call this evening, as I am completely and utterly sober. So, if you find yourself in the course of the conversation asking yourself, who is this?
I don't believe it for a moment. I don't believe
No,
it.
it's true. It's completely and utterly true. It is. You could trust it like you could trust a press release from the Israeli Foreign Ministry. It's
Well, there you
abs
go.
yeah, completely legit, kosher. So,
Well, I'm sober myself, I'm afraid. It's only 1 p.m. here, and I've got a cup of tea that was made for me. Tea, for Christ's sake, if you could imagine that.
hello, is that middle age?
Yeah, well, said hello to that a long time ago. Jesus.
Yeah. Hmm.
No, I expected to hit some beers later. Just woke up with that feeling of just desperate despair, and I thought, well, I see at least a half dozen Belgian beers coming at me in a
Now,
couple
can I
hours. But
ask, this is an interesting thing. We spoke about this the last night, but this issue of despair. And I think I did say I've never felt it like this before. I've never genuinely felt a gripping despair about what I see around me. Now, strangely, I'd have to consider this alongside the fact my personal life is going extremely well. It's not just some sort of, whole series of personal issues, and so I'm in despair. Life in its way is good in the very micro sense. In the macro sense, this place is a fucking open air lunatic asylum. And which would be fine. I could sit back, drink beer, and enjoy it. But I have a very real feeling it's going to start impinging on me personally in the medium term future.
yeah, I can see that. George Carlin said years ago in an interview that living today was like just having a front row seat at the freak show. And that's what it is. I mean, you just what a freak show is something that has no redeeming ideal above it
Yeah.
that splits it from itself and causes a lot of tension. I've given a lot of thought lately because I keep thinking about it. You keep running up against this obstacle of your fellow man in their collective capacity, in his collective capacity. And what do you find? I mean, it's just a freak show, but there's no knowledge of it. There's no knowledge that it is a freak show. They actually think that they're, doing what they should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And alongside that, I did see that there was some report, can't remember where I came across it, but it was a survey of mean IQ, I think in France. And they found over the last 25 years a precipitous drop from over the 100 mark to somewhere now in the high 90s. Now, why that is really by the by. But it does point to that in itself, those sort of developments naturally play the part in obliviating, um, what hope one could have for um, a cultural response that would generate social and political changes, which would be structurally adequate to meeting any number of problems we face.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the stupidity is it's omnipresent. You can't get outside of it, and it's at all the highest levels. The stupidity is massive. You could easily see the world lurching into World War III. Just
Yeah.
something that 15 years ago would be unthinkable. Oh, we're past the fall of the Soviet Union, and now this is open-ended bright future. And boom, there it is again. It's just the same fucking idiots are always in charge, and they
Yeah.
drag everyone else along with them.
Well, I did have my own metric for a long time. For a long time, I thought Third World War was a rank impossibility. no matter what, nobody would be that stupid.
Yeah.
Well, look at Syria. How many countries are now in the mix there? How many different powers are playing off each other? I think I saw a pretty good political cartoon somewhere, but it basically shows, the airspace above Syria being crowded by this air force and that, tripping over each other. Of course, on the ground, how many factions? Well, we don't actually know. That's another frustrating or another particular aspect of this, that we can take it at this stage that the free press is completely is the pure instrument of political power. It's just propaganda is what's coming through. But that's true from the Western media, but it's equally true of the supposedly independents like Russia today. You just have wall of wall lies, and it's impossible logically to disentangle. So we look at this thing with the Russian jet being shot down over Turkey, or shut down by the Turks. What happened? Well, fuck, who knows? Um, and that's the sad thing, I've often had the mind that, like, I was going to, some years ago, I had the idea of just keeping a camera with me at all times and just taking just photos of the opportunity arose. But it was going to be like, my title was Notes from a Dying Planet. And if I could capture visual absurdities, and I thought this would be a fine legacy to hand down to my kids. And then at a later point, I got even more ambitious. You find these diaries. I think notable one was, I think it was a Victor Klempner, the Jew in Dresden, and he wrote diaries right to the last, extensive diaries. I thought, this would be something I could do too. I could actually write a day-by-day diary and actually say to my children, yeah, look, you know what? Some of us could see the writing was on the wall. We knew it was coming. Yeah, and I laugh at that idea now because what could I record? I don't actually know what's going on. I just, there just seems the Middle East is I find the Islamic State is, of course, it's, I don't know what to say about it. What I find most interesting about it, or what I find exciting about the Islamic State, and exciting is the word I use, is the world hasn't seen such an emphatic invitation for genocide that ISIS presents. If anyone is asking for it, it's them. And what I actually love about ISIS is they do have a fair scale of lunatic ambition that's been dug out. There's a great report done by I think he was with Die Welt, and he managed to interview the ISIS leadership. He spent some time there with their ideologues and asked them, what's it all about? Now, ISIS, of course, they are they're theocratically doctrinaire. As Islamic scholars say, these guys are very, very close to the Islam of the book, and that's how they present themselves, and that's their their ideological glue. But what this journalist reported is that these guys are literally intent on world conquest, everything, the whole world. And of course, to do it bit by bit by bit, and so on and so forth. But there's this, you haven't seen again this sort of ambition since the Mongols, or even the Nazis. And as you know, with Nazism, I mean, what its particular allure and its power was drawn from the fact that it had established itself in arguably the most scientifically and technologically evolved society on the planet. ISIS, on the other hand, are going to launch their mission of world conquest from one of the most benighted shitholes on God's green earth, which you just have to salute on some level. And not only that, they've managed to position themselves between any number of mid-ranking nuclear armed countries who just have those sort of historical chips on the shoulder that would make them ready to use those weapons. I just can't see India or Israel or Russia just rolling over and letting it all happen. So this is the prospect we face. And on top of that, if ISIS somehow let us down, and if the gun on the wall of the room doesn't go off, we do have climate change to fall back on. And if you ever follow this, you find just any number of reports which are alarming to sane people. They're not even stimulating to someone like me who's I've been reading this a long time, and it's just more of the same. You're fucked, you're fucked, you're fucked, you're fucked. It's just this drumbeat. So yeah, it's a strange world, a mad world, but here we are.
Well, there's a lot that could be said. I don't know. I don't see any evidence for climate change other than that the extraterrestrials have been repeatedly warning us about it.
Yeah,
And
they have.
at this point, because it's so motivated, the so-called climate science, they do alter the figures. They
Yeah,
do have a political agenda. They are using it in order to advance these notions of population reduction and so on and so forth. They do want you eating insects and living in a room with bunk beds and 30 other workers who don't have jobs, slaves. So this is why climate change is even discussed, because there are people who think that they can make a lot of money off of it, and people who think that there are too many human beings on the planet and that we need to, reduce the standard of living and get them all to do so willingly. That's it doesn't touch the issue of whether the
yeah,
climate is actually changing, but
yeah,
it's why it's even being discussed or advanced at all in the so-called public discourse, because there's an awful motivation behind it. But I keep thinking about it, and for the longest time, I thought the likely scenario is precisely the one presented in that wonderful true text, The Key, with the rapid climate change, the kind of snapping effect of
mm,
warming, snapping back into a brutal ice age. All very plausible. Made much more sense that there would be a kind of built-in global reset mechanism than that the planet would just go into a runaway warming period that would never
yeah,
cease. There were, in fact, ice ages, and we're due for one again. So it made good sense. But we know the troubles with that book. And where was all of the predicted warming that was supposed to take place just over the past 10 or 15 years? Where are the super hurricanes? You go back, you look at the news reports from 7, 8 years ago. Well, every summer now you can expect to have a Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf. And well, where is it? Oh, well, our models were wrong. Oh, the sun is cooled. Oh,
mm,
so nobody knows what the fuck's going on. You can't demonstrate it to the degree required to justify overhauling the civilization. I mean, I'm all for green energy, zero pollution, that sort of thing for its own sake. But the idea that the science as it exists with these computer models, which are themselves just playing out certain assumptions that are fed in, the idea that these computer models tell us anything definite, and that you're anti-science if you're a climate denier, just like you're a Holocaust denier, you're a climate denier. Yeah, fuck. It's just more insanity. It's just layers of insanity.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, even at just that, sort of on the first glance response, like I'm old enough to remember the warnings of doom in the late '90s about this. And of course, I know none of it has come to pass. I mean, supposedly, yeah, Northern Europe would be like Ibiza by now. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Um, and yeah, hurricanes, droughts, the rest of it. It's just, I mean, it just hasn't happened on the level supposed. I mean, there's even the failure isn't just on sort of the journalistic level. You've had some of the leading lights. I may have this wrong, but it was, I think, James Hansen, who had been, I think he was the chief modeler at NASA or something like this, and I think he, as part of his testimony to Congress on this topic in the early 1990s, he had the very arresting image of Manhattan being underwater by 2010. I think he gave some timescale like that, presented some such image. But of course, none of this has been, backwalked or backtracked in the public discourse. You don't hear of these predictions going awry. Another one I remember, from the same time was, Africa was to be by 2015, according to the projections, should be home of only, rhinos, elephants, and monkeys, because HIV and AIDS was going to cut such swath. But looking back on it, you can see there that's clearly political and just driven at securing funds.
Yeah, I mean, in the 70s, there was a big scare about global cooling. And there are all sorts of magazines devoted to it, the coming ice age and so on. And again, there may be some truth to it. That may be one piece to the puzzle. And then now, with the global warming, you've got another piece to the puzzle. And sure, the science is improving, but is it at the level yet where it justifies this sort of mania? So I don't know. I don't know. Well, the climate change scenario reported by Jim Sparks, where all the people are sitting in the room watching the photos, 3D holograms of the Earth just getting grayer and dirtier and just dying slowly. That seems to me now to be a possible scenario. So sure. You don't have runaway global cooling. You don't have this snap-back circuit breaker into an ice age. Maybe it just gets worse and worse and worse, and then, after the next 2,000 years or so, it's a mostly dead world.
Yeah.
But that's still an entirely different scenario than any of the ones we've been presented with.
Yeah, it's interesting, to actually, look at the abduction, the contactee reports that are there. Yeah, you do this incessant, repeated warning for the future. I think I once had email contact with, he was an American, I'd say this is about 10 years ago, so he would have been like me, late 20s. We were the same age, is what I remember. And he basically had a meeting with a master of the key-like figure. However, he didn't get that much information. He didn't receive, there was no extensive conversation. What he recalled was this guy basically woke him up. He was an old guy. He was in bed with his girlfriend, and they went out into the living room. They sat there and they began talking, and then this guy realized he was actually in the nude. He just realized, what the fuck, and as he thought that, this guy tossed him a pillow so he could obviously hide his dignity. But it was a sort of a telepathy present there. Then this guy just asked him a series of kind of questions, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? What do you think of the other? UFO subject, Atlantis. And what this guy James, what he told me was he seemed very happy when he was with some of these answers. When he I think the question about Atlantis, what do you think of that? He said, oh, it's complete bullshit. He could almost feel this guy was disappointed. It was a strange thing. There was no overt sign of disappointment. But the guy then floated a couple of books off his bookshelf and floated them down onto the couch beside him, which was one thing. But he said categorically, the environment is going to just go through, we're going to go through hell, is what he said. And I kept on an extensive sort of, back and forth with this guy, James. And he sort of told me more and more that he even saw this guy on the street one day. And he tried to, in a bookshop actually, he tried to engage with him. No joy. Couldn't couldn't catch up with him. He also had, at times he said he felt he was being followed by, he wasn't sure what, government agents of some kind. That sort of stopped. And then he had also a number of UFO sightings that he tried to report to the local press, took photos of, and he said that brought more interest from some undetermined group. There was one other thing he then reported. He said that some years later he was taken into a craft, and he was shown, he was brought to, or he didn't know whether he was actually brought forward into the future or just shown, something via the technology, like a projection. But he saw the coastline of the eastern United States. And as I recount this, I can remember the image I had in my mind as he wrote this to me. It was essentially Florida is largely underwater. But there was also another striking, but he saw this from space, from a height. He could see the whole Floridian Peninsula, or what you call it. But he had another image of where he was just out at sea, just over the horizon, looking at a city, but the city was completely darkened and flooded. And he had to ask, where is that? And he was told that's New York City. And now, that's just one story. It was just, there was just an extraordinary vividness of detail in this man's account. He's not a public figure. He's not trying to sell any books or anything. He's just chatting with some guy in Australia who seems interested. And, that kind of thing stuck with me, because I couldn't see in that any reason why they would lie to him about this, why some group would take it upon themselves to sort of spin this story. Like they weren't looking for him to do anything. He didn't have to write a book, become a public figure, or go talking. None of that. They seemed most concerned just with his health and it was all small stuff. They advised him to grow a garden, let it just go wild. Just grow a garden, a patch of forest, look after it. They're very interested in his meditative practice, what he was doing. They sort of strongly suggested that he sort of, purify his diet, like go through juice fasts and the like, this sort of thing. And you then this detail about that we're basically just going to get hammered. We're going through enormous changes and very, very difficult times. And I look at that story and naturally it stays with me.
Well, I've wondered in the past whether the reason for the differences behind all of these visions of what is going to happen presented by so-called visitors to so-called human beings is that they have a different relationship to the future. Just, period. They have a different relationship to the future. So when they're showing people these different visions and they are showing them, for example, a single vision and strongly suggesting that it is real, it will happen, and then it doesn't happen, it could be because their relationship to the future in general is different than ours. And as a result, it's perfectly legitimate for them to say, well, this is what the future will be, because in some sense they have, I don't know, a greater sense of the probabilities. For us, the future is basically an unknown place. We can use our imagination and maybe very, very slightly, in a very subtle way, feel out different terrains that encompass the present and the future to different extents, But they may just think of the future as a totally different thing because they relate more directly to it. If they have a greater now that encompasses more of the past and the future, they may well believe that something will happen and show a vision accordingly that they believe is the future, and then it doesn't happen. But that for them, this is no contradiction.
Okay. Well, may have mentioned this, but a friend of mine, his mother recently, she passed away. This lady had been abducted in the early 70s. She had an implant. And in her experience, she, while on board the craft, she said to them, what's going on? They said, look, you're not going to remember this. But we put in something to help you when the time comes. I said, what time? And they said, the time will come in this world when we're going to need you to do a job for us. We can't tell you what it is. Oh no. We're happy to tell you what it is, but once we tell you, you're not going to remember. And so they told her, and she never remembered what it was. Now, this lady passed away, recently. And all her life, as particularly as she aged, she wondered what the hell it was about. Like, she got older, she could say, well, I'm not used to anybody. How could I be, what job can I do? And interestingly, on her deathbed, when she basically lost the ability to communicate, she pointed at the implant. She was with her sister, I think, at the time. She pointed at it repeatedly. Now, what could that mean? Who knows? But that's a very clear instance of someone being told a future that just didn't happen. And of course, if you do even a most cursory research online, you'll find any number of predictions from people who've claimed contact that haven't come to pass. I can think just offhand one very, very vivid, interesting story where someone was told, yeah, 2010, that's the year it's all going to happen. There's another one now here's an interesting one. Linda Moulton Howe has it on Earth Files. I can't remember what this story's called, but it dates back to 2003, 2000, maybe a bit earlier. Anyway, this guy had a whole timeline and events and developments on it. And of course, war with Iran was on there. And he had sort of an image of an aircraft carrier being struck and the rest. And then there being explosions inside the US and martial law being imposed, and then there's outbreaks of disease. And this is a whole very vivid scenarios to him. And in his account, he spoke about how he had seen the first Gulf War in 1991, and he'd been told once that happens, it's 18 years after that point before this great war. And he did say in his account, he said he was told that the Gulf War would be fought in December of 1991. It wasn't, it was fought in January 1991. He said that was something that surprised him, is that the date could have been off like that. And then on top of that, what really grabbed me in these scenarios he drew out was, one is the imposition of martial law throughout Western countries, what it would look like, what it would feel like. I thought that was quite accurate in light of what I've read as regards, such an eventuality. But he included a very interesting little detail. He said that the US would become defined by inequality. That there would be this yawning division between haves and have-nots. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but concern and talk of the 1% just wasn't current in 2003, 2004. Although, of course, that division was present, but I mean, it's since grown by then, grown since then, without any ameliorative political response, which speaks to this broader point, is that from another perspective, is that the future is just far more probabilistic, including simultaneously any number of scenarios And it just seemed in that instance, I'm recalling from Linda Moulton, how where you have an account which is both, on one level, maybe uh, marked by some accurate prediction, and then, of course, defined by wholly inaccurate forecasts.
It certainly seems that way. And in trying to account for why or how that could be the case, I mean, you have a few different possibilities. One is just, wholesale lying, that they give people these visions of these futures just to fuck with them, to test them somehow, to see their response, and so on. On the other hand, if you try to correlate this issue with other issues related to their supposed control of time and space, or at least their relative ability to travel through it, then you have to wonder whether it's something about them in a more fundamental way, which is sort of what I've been trying to get at. We assume that when we talk about the now, the present, that we're talking about something which is not only concrete and determined, but present in its entirety. And the example's always given. People knock on their table, they'll say, oh, well, here's the table, here's the chair I'm sitting on, this is the present, this is the now. It's either raining or it's not raining. I can describe it propositionally and determine whether it's true or false, whereas the future I can't do that, et cetera, et cetera. But if you really look at the now in a more truthful way, it's really not as determined as we would like to think. And it's also kind of a type of space. The human brain, you've got all of these neurons firing what we would like to think is as being simultaneously, but it's not simultaneous. Where is the now in the brain? If you've got 6 or 8 or 10 billion neurons all firing, none of them are firing with perfect simultaneity compared to others. One may be in the process of firing, whereas one has only begun to fire. One is not firing. So if you think of time in terms of the biology of neural firing, synaptic communication, and so on, the now cannot be pinpointed at any particular place in the brain. You can't just point to one neuron and say, here's the now, and everything else is either ahead of it or behind it. And it's the same with relativity, basic relativity. If you consider that two things in space do not share an absolute frame of reference when it comes to time, because everything in space is going at some particular speed and has a certain relationship to its own mass and the mass of things around it, so on and so forth. There is no absolute frame of reference for time. This is why the atomic clock that's thrown up into the upper atmosphere or into space, when they bring it back down and compare it to its twin clock, now there's a discrepancy. There is no simultaneous absolute now. It's a distributed now. Well, if you have a distributed type of now with a measurable extent, let's say, what if you increase that extent? Well, maybe then you have something more like the consciousness of these so-called visitors. I mean, the human consciousness occupies a sort of space, a terrain that we call now, and we frequently symbolize it as being a point, but it's not a point. It's a space of a certain extent, which, of course, we can't get outside of in order to measure. And that extent includes something of what we call the future and something of what we call the past. At any given so-called moment, there's a bit of an overlap between the future, which is flowing backwards into the now, and the past, which is flowing forward into the future. That space is the now. Well, what if the space that we're talking about were broader in extent, so it encompassed more of the future and more of the past? Well, you might have the consciousness of the visitors. So they are experiencing a particular future as real inasmuch as to them it falls within their now moment. Mm-hmm. So, they go directly to it in their imagination or based on their knowledge. They say, well, this is what's going to happen. But of course, just like our consciousness is not the same as reality, quote unquote. So the reality is able to go its own way at its own speed, configure itself appropriately so that they're wrong. In fact, you could say that most of the time they're wrong, except in the most general possible way with general themes. All of these predictions are wrong, these visions of the future. Just look at all of the disparate visions of the future Strieber has had, however contaminated by his own imagination. These countless visions. He was writing novels about runaway global warming back in the 80s. Nature's End was basically that kind of scenario combined with massive overpopulation. And of course, all of these novels, he claims, knowledge and insight I got from the visitors made me concerned. But, that scenario was not the master of the key scenario of a global reset into an ice age. No. He had to see it in the news first, in the Discovery magazine and so on. But that's a separate issue. You see what I mean? I mean, your basic experience of time, if it is different, will lead to, a different interpretation of things in general.
Yeah.
And they may present something to us as real, sincerely, because to them it's real, and yet it just doesn't happen.
Yeah. It's there is something else I think of when we look at this. It's to do with consciousness again, but on its development. I remember Gurdjieff, he was once asked, he said, what could change things here, in this world? What could really make a change? And he said, if it became possible for everyone to remember that everyone around them, including themselves, will someday die, he said, that alone would change things. And I wonder, these hugely overwrought scenarios that are presented to so many people who are contactees or abductees, are they simply, metaphors or just scary stories to remind them that they too will die, and that it's really to put their life into a certain context? That if you wake up the next day and you think to yourself, holy shit, you're just overwhelmed by it. Well, then you is likely to just get caught up in some sort of, you're less likely to suffer for a subliminal relationship with your own mind and feelings thereafter. And you will call into question just a lot of the stupidity of the things around you. You're trying to retain some sense of, or at least, the question of value of your action or the actions of those around you will be much more present in your mind. So I wonder too, is that just part of it? You got some guy, you need to wake him up. Well, we just filmed that fucking movie about New York being flooded. For me, that that makes some sense too.
No, I'm with you on that. In as much, I've wondered something very similar, and that is, and it's occurred to me looking at my own state of mind, that for the past, 10, 15, 20 years or more, a lot of my unconscious, the tone of my existence is really dominated by, or at least strongly affected by, this knowledge, quote unquote, that things could end at any time.
Yeah.
Environmental collapse. I've taken it for granted ever since the 90s that, the millennialism of the 90s for me was when it began, because I was of a certain age to encounter it, but it's never really departed. But then I get to thinking, this kind of like added stress that I carry, that the environment's collapsing and everything's collapsing. People in earlier epochs didn't have that. People, maybe a few thousand years ago would be more accustomed in their daily lives to waking up thinking that the world had always been and that it always would be.
Yeah.
And what a different way of life that is. Like, what a different just sense of living in the world. And I thought, oh, if you take this notion of trying to trigger evolution from a book like The Key, if you take that notion that they're interested in triggering our evolution and you view it alongside that, you have an explanation for all of these apocalyptic disaster scenarios where we're all going to die. We're all going to die immediately. It's going to be, it's going to be nukes going off in Washington, martial law, or it's going to be global warming. It's going to be overpopulation. It's going to be ice age. Maybe that, the actual reality, quote unquote, might be a slow environmental collapse that just ends in silence after a couple thousand years.
Yeah.
But that they're giving us all this shit now and convincing us of imminent doom in order to trigger that evolution.
Yeah, and alongside that, you can think that now, given the sheer variety of accounts that one can come across, is that the entire, this subculture has been entirely populated with scenarios that at least one of which everyone who enters into this culture will find plausible. So there are some people who temperamentally think, yeah, there'll be a third world war. Guess what? Of course, they'll find a third world war prediction scenario, prediction collapse scenario. Other people, global warming's more their taste, or forests get cut down, we run out of oxygen. Like all those scenarios are there. So in a way, it's almost like the intellect finally finds the intuition which confirms itself. And then it's almost as if, okay, I have the answer. I've figured out the future. I'm going to die. And then maybe that of course is the beginning of the development of consciousness. The Buddha's last words supposedly were, all compounded things decay. Work diligently on your salvation. And now that we sort of tease it out, I mean, right now, to just bring it right to the personal, I've got a real issue with a woman, and it's that she is very beautiful. She's by far the most beautiful woman I've ever been involved with. She's very curvaceous. She's very intelligent. She's very blonde, and very married. So it's
Yeah.
it just again, as I sit down to my meal of despair, it's like, fuck it, we can get another bit on top here. But and so I kind of look at this and I notice that in the recesses of my mind, I have this wild fantasy of actually just living out a staid, bourgeois, middle-class existence anywhere in the developed world, in complete anonymity and anodyne in every dimension, apart from just having a little wife, looking after children, and just carrying on for 30, 40 years and dying. Now, on one level, that's for the human race, that's a huge evolutionary step up. Like for the German people, it's been tremendous that this is how they've found their way. To put the tribalism on the shelf for a while and just try this. And that for me is a distraction. But coming at it from someone who my passion has been in for spirituality in its various forms, and from that perspective, that bourgeois, just a very middle class, anonymous existence is a catastrophe for that pursuit. Just about the worst fucking thing that could happen to me is if this woman were in point of fact single and it was straightforward. We'd go out, I make her happy, we've sex, we're all happy, and then I lose 15, 20 years. And from the perspective of development of consciousness, I can tell you something which is quite harsh. I've been in various groups and I noticed that the older members make zero progress. They just don't have the juice for it. I think my sense of it is in terms of if there's to be an actual change of consciousness, an actual transformation, it occurs in your relative youth or it never will at all. And I know Ken Wilber tells the tale of, you can track psychological development. He says, we'll climb up to the early 20s or mid 20s, typically, and plateau out until the late 50s. So, apparently the 50s is when most homosexuals come out. This is obviously the age, big changes begin to happen again because people are sort of liberated from certain responsibilities, and certain interests just fade. The challenge to make money or secure position, it no longer attracts. So in a way, I wonder, is this, are these extraterrestrials in a way, they're simply applying what the Japanese call it paya, skillful means in the development of consciousness.
Well,
Yeah,
taken out of context, I'd say there's no doubt because everything about them seems to scream skillful means.
yeah,
But no, I think that I've been saying for years, and no one wants to listen, but I've been saying since, I was 30 probably. I said, well, I've passed my peak. It's all downhill from here. Maybe people were appalled. Oh, how absurd. Blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, you just look at any piece of news from the medical world. They say that in your 30s, your early 30s, in the human being, your organs start to fail.
mm,
Once about, you hit 30, your organs start to fail. It's a long, slow decline, which socially we don't notice. We don't have any place for it in the consciousness at the moment. But having inhabited my own brain for so long, I was in deep despair over it at the time. Not because I just read some news article, but I had already been experiencing it for a long time before finding any kind of outward piece of confirmation like that. Because in those days, I was ramped up to use my brain for maximum product. I was just whatever the maximum was, that's what I was trying to get out of it. And so for, several years, I really struggled because I could feel the momentum slowing.
mm,
Because the simple fact is that most of your creativity, without you ever realizing it, and for as much as you'd like to take credit for it, is the result of the physical changes of your body. Creates a tremendous amount of energy.
yeah,
You go through the period of puberty, physical change. There's massive mental stimulation that comes with that. When you emerge out of the gates into your 20s as a free adult, now legally recognized by the state as someone who can move around from place to place and do whatever the fuck you want, pretty much, that's massively stimulating. And there are physical changes that continue. I mean, I think your brain doesn't reach maturation until 25. And 21, you still inhabit sort of a kid's body, half adult, half kid. But anyway, so you continue to experience physical change of one sort or another, probably until your late 20s or early 30s. And then this wonderful engine that's been spinning up the whole time of stimulation starts to spin down. And if you are at all in tune with yourself, you have any idea what the fuck's going on with you, you notice it. And it's a simple fact that most writers, their best works are written when they're young, in their 20s. Nobody busts out at age 80 with a masterpiece. It simply does not happen. And you want to be more precise about it, the fact is most writers, for example, these books that they keep spitting out in their 50s, 60s, 70s, they're garbage. I mean, there are refinements, there are technical refinements, but the energy is totally lost. There's nothing there. And it's out of pure vanity that they keep doing it. Speaking of
yeah,
vanity, I mean, I read the abridged version of the Memoirs of Casanova a few years back. There's like a Penguin edition of it. It was quite fascinating. But at one point he said, just in passing, that these women, these old women of the time, obviously he's speaking of as if it's now, they were laughing or ridiculing because basically what it comes down to is from their point of view, if you're a man and you want to continue fucking when you're in your 30s or older, it's simply out of vanity. So they had this idea of like just the pure biology of it, which was obvious to the old women, which is, you're in your late teens, you're in your 20s, you're fucking because that's a stage of your life. But if you're going to keep fucking and going out of your way to screw When you're in your 30s, it's simply out of vanity, basically ego or, affectation, which today is preposterous. We widen the window, we go up as high as we possibly can. Oh, you can have a active sex life in your early 90s. Well, fuck you. Should you? And if you want to, is there something wrong with you? Well, we can't think through these questions. But
Yeah.
it's all of a piece, is what I guess what I'm getting at. Your brain is a physical organ in a physical body. And as much as we would like to separate the mind and creativity from it in a very vain fashion, we really shouldn't. And they're connected in much more primitive ways than culturally we allow presently. Which is why for the past, I don't know, 5 or 6 years especially, I really haven't given a fuck. I've just been drinking constantly. I mean, imagine if you're a surgeon with super delicately honed tools, scalpels, titanium with a microscopic edge and all that, and you perform wonderful surgeries with them for years, and then all of a sudden there's no more surgery to be performed, but you're expected to basically use the tools to chop meat at the butcher shop. Well, you lose respect for your tools and you realize you're never going to be able to put them to any real use again in the same way. So you start to abuse the tools. Maybe you'll start throwing them at the wall one day like they're darts, or maybe you'll drop them and hack each, you'll give a shit about it. The tools do nothing anymore that's wonderful, so fuck it. So that's how it's been with me. I mean, I'll pour a glass of grain alcohol, and when I've got nothing else to drink, and I'll chase it with some water and I'll drink The effects on my brain must be devastating, but, who gives a shit? It's invisible anyway, right? The only person who knows is me. Fuck 'em. It's making me thirsty for a drink.
Yeah, I know. All this talk. Yeah. Well, I think one thing I have to just say that is that there's some consolation in the pattern of enlightenment and when it can happen in people's lives, according to the traditions. And it doesn't tend to follow that sort of bell curve. Sure, there are people who make it in their 20s. They're very rare. Some in the 30s, but a lot of people do come to the the great states in the 40s and 50s.
Well, enlightenment, as you refer to it, and artistic production, they may well be two different things. And in the end, it may be that artistic production has far less value than we like to think. It could be. I
Do you
know.
think, again, just like you say, in terms of artistic production and the social sciences and the thinkers. Now, of course, there's product outside of 20s and early 30s, but would you say generally there's a little more genuine creative emergence, and it's more just a sort of elaboration on already established things? Because I remember once reading a quote about Chomsky that he's been writing the same book for 50 years.
Well, that's basically what it is. If you're a comedian, you come up with your best jokes early and then you reuse them, or you make variations on them that aren't as good. I think that is a near universal rule. It may apply in all cases. When you're young, let's say early adulthood, the early 20s, you come at the human system from an outsider perspective. You can't but do that. So in a way, you have a wholly distorted view of things to the extent that you view it at all clearly. So let me try to be more precise. I mean, you're a child, you're growing up, you're being raised in this world, and you're raised to think that things obey rules. And even if the rules are not reasonable, that they obey a logic. And you reach adulthood and you see the world, especially the human world, strictly in terms of its logic. So really what you're confronting is the logic of the world. And then if you are a person at that age who starts to produce creatively, what your creative production really is an interaction with that logic. But it's not an interaction with the real world, right? When you're 50 and you've been besotted with the world and beaten down by it, and you've got the sloping shoulders because you've been carrying the burden of 30 more years of shitty experiences that really are the world. Now you have a more truthful understanding of the world, but there's no way you can evaluate the world creatively because you're in it.
Mm.
So when you're young and there are social conventions and you have this robust energy because of your physical youth, you can make fun of those social conventions in all sorts of ingenious ways. And you look at Monty Python, for Christ's sake, how young they were when they were doing their best material.
Yeah.
Because they're still viewing it as an outsider. They can see it qua logic, its own logic, and then they, do variations on the logic to show how absurd it all is. And it's enormously stimulating to somebody who is able to watch it and enjoy it. But then, these guys are in their 80s now, and what shit do they do now? Well, nothing, and they haven't done anything for a long time. It's because they're
Yeah.
in the world. They're not viewing it partly from the outside. You gain wisdom and experience the older you get, but also like the price of that wisdom and experience is creativity, because creativity only really comes through falsehood. You have a false relationship to the world.
Sure. Well, it's very, this is something I've been talking about in the context of the Gurdjieff work. And one thing is in the work the point to is that your subjective sense of time changes as you age. So you have the old saw, the years just fly by. And in a way, from the perspective of the work, the reason people say that is because it's true. And what technically they would say is the quantity of impressions being absorbed is falling drastically as the personality crystallizes and thereby reduces to the point of eliminating all moments of genuine consciousness, which would involve the attention inhabiting is full a part of the parasympathetic nervous system as possible, which is to say, as we age, we become fixed in views. All our experience is coming through these filters, but the experience is diminished for that. So, any number of scenarios suggest themselves. But what it does mean is that, naturally enough, the patterns will, in the first instance, repeat themselves, but repeat themselves in ever-decreasing concentric circles, which I'm not sure if I'm getting it across, but there's an awful lot in that which explains an awful lot to me of what I've seen in as people age and what happens to them.
No, I follow you. I follow you. I could say the same thing in different words, which is that,
Sure.
which would be that for every experience, the amount of it that is new rapidly diminishes after a certain point. The amount of newness to experience becomes almost zero, to the point where once you reach a certain age, if there is newness to an experience, it's anxiety producing. It makes you uncomfortable. You don't like it because you're now so accustomed to no newness in experience that you would prefer not to have it. But there is always a certain time in your life when everything is new, or most everything is new. And this is the case always for a long time. And that's a totally different relationship to the world than when you are older and now basically nothing is new.
Yeah, and that, just to add to that, I mean, of course, when I've seen this through the lives of people I know quite well, and I have one friend. He is considerably older than me, but he's extremely youthful in his sort of disposition. But significantly, he spent a huge amount of time just traveling around the world. He can afford to do so, and he just basically is almost like a nomad. And I put that down in no small part to the fact that the quality of impressions he receives. If you're constantly in new locale, well, your life is going to have a vividness that's just that I don't find in my life. Um, and I even highlight this against. I look at my living now. I mean, I live, a walk away from a glorious beach filled with women in ever shrinking bikinis. It's, very hot climate, very clean, everything, so on and so forth. But I've just this deadened feel to it all. I'm just not absorbing it. And that, I have to say, it kind of worries me in a way. There's a sort of psychological death I feel, and I know it in the context of the work that it can be undone, but it just takes tremendous effort, and naturally I have my doubts about that particular approach. And so I even find, to confess, I think really I should look into hard drugs. What's wrong with just the odd controlled hit? I mean, fuck, it might liven things up a bit. Um,
Yeah, I think about it often. I'd love to get my hands on some heroin and see how far I can get with it, but I haven't had any luck so far.
um, there's someone I know has come into my acquaintance. I even noticed the way I kind of responded to him. I could smell the marijuana. I thought to myself, now, if there's anyone I know who could get ecstasy, it's this guy. So, of course, it's this would be something I'd aim to do in the privacy of my own home. I just sit down, take this sucker, and see what happens. Um, so, you know, it's that's where I'm at with things. This sort of ever progressive deadening is sort of ongoing, and around you, what compounds things is that there any number of people who you're surrounded by people who just don't see this. We're completely indifferent to it, and so you end up having this conversation basically with very few people.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I fled the US was because the patterns were becoming so crystallized themselves, and they just also happen to be pretty awful patterns, that I said, fuck this, I'm going to make a dramatic break. And then when I
Sorry,
got,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
well, when I got to Europe for a period of many months, it was an enormously stimulating time because of the situation I put myself in. So my notion, looking back on things for probably as long as I've been alive, is to put myself in situations that end up being stimulating. I guess that's been my method.
Right.
So, say it again.
Yeah. Well, look, you see, this is something. You're really onto something. I've noticed in my interaction with this girl at my work, of all the women start developing a relationship with, her partner is or was, I don't know whether you can use the past tense in this instance, a leading figure in Perth or organized crime in this city. This guy, she said he would literally fucking kill me if he found out about us. Now, please note, nothing has actually happened. I haven't kissed her, I haven't slept with her, but the feeling is such, there's such chemistry. She's saying It's wrecking her relationship. Now, I've kind of sit back and I think about this, and I think about, I have another colleague. She's very pleasant. She's not particularly attractive. She's not unattractive. She is very grounded and someone you could easily spend time with and have sex with and the rest. But of course, I'm not interested in that at all. And I wonder, just some part of my own consciousness is attracted to vivid drama, because I have noticed that, and I wonder if that's just in part, if my life is any meaning, it's just to drive satisfaction and peace in the everyday.
Well, this is why I've never really found it personally necessary to go into any kind of organized spiritual practice, because it's always seemed to me that everyday life is already that practice.
Yeah,
it's not a perfect way to execute. There's no perfect form of execution of it, but I mean, what you've described, the situation, the creation of drama, that would be a term that would be applied by people, outside the situation. But obviously, internally, it's an enormously stimulating situation, particularly in its destructive aspect.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
There's a phrase in the key that's used maybe more than once, but at least once. This phrase gains energy. I think in that book it's used in the context of saying if you make amends for your sins, if you right the wrongs that you've done, you will enormously gain energy. But this very idea of gaining energy it's an obscure type of formulation until you kind of grasp the reality to which it might refer. And that is, what we were just talking about. If you talk about the difference, the intrinsic difference between new experience and experience which has no newness to it, what's the difference? We can say it's stimulating, but that almost still sounds too aesthetic. Really, what we're talking about is something in you has greater energy, not in terms of, I drank 3 espressos and now I can go out and run around. But like some spiritual part of you, maybe the soul, whatever it is, there's an enormous gain in energy when you are in a situation that calls for it. And this is what it means to be alive. And this is the opposite of the dead, droning, repetitive experience of the world that many people fall into. So I understand that very well. I told you last time the story about working at a job and putting up the slip of paper that says, "I'm a champion of bad ideas."
Yeah, I remember that.
You may not remember it, but
it's penetrated through the fog of my alcoholic memory there. Yeah.
It's all right. I'll recap it briefly. I was at a shitty customer service job, working at a cubicle, and I wrote this thing on a piece of paper, and I put it up on the wall. I said, "I'm a champion of bad ideas." And not long thereafter, some corporate bigwig was supposedly descending from on high to make a visit, and I came to work one day and found that the thing was gone. And I had been told that one of the managers who had been going around making sure everything was nice and neat and in order in all the cubicles saw my note in its badly written scrawl and decided to remove it because it was offensive. So what I did then was I wrote an email to the head of the call center, and I said, "Well, I'll have you know this quote was by Martin Luther King Jr., and I have to wonder what kind of place I'm working at that finds offensive quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. Now, that's a total lie. But then we had a private meeting, and, he was very apologetic and almost jumping up and down in his chair, so eager to apologize. He was, "If I had known it had been said by Martin Luther King Jr., here where we encourage diversity and we're opposed to discrimination, blah, blah, blah." But anyway, part of the meaning for the quote was precisely what we're talking about. I'm a champion of bad ideas. It's a bad idea. Something's a bad idea, and you do it, and now you're in a completely ridiculous situation. That can be enormously stimulating, even though at the level of the ego, you're going through nothing but horrible conscious agony, thinking, "Oh my God, this is fucking awful." It can also, on a completely different level, be enormously stimulating. So I've done that for years. I've lurched from one crazy, absurd situation to another. And I get some satisfaction out of, I'll tell friends the stories and they'll say, oh, this could only happen to you, or, oh, I can't believe these stories that you have. And I go from one to the next. And in my day-to-day experience, I'll often experience this shit as just being absolutely awful. But at the same time, part of me will engineer it quite ingeniously and bring it about a ridiculous situation so that there is that kind of gain. And everyday life does afford these opportunities. So it's not always necessary to go into some kind of artificial spiritual practice. If you know how to manipulate your own daily life, if you have a relationship to your own life where you can gain these energies, then it's not always necessary.
Well, no. I mean, what's happening is that all you're doing is playing out, is recognizing certain patterns in your consciousness. You're not so naturally enough. In my instance, it's that I'm horny and I simply couldn't give a fuck who she's involved with. Is disreputable and unethical as that is, that's just a reality. But what even from the perspective of realization, what is involved there is that in bringing the whole point of incarnation of the material existence is to bring these patterns into crisp relief. They're just not as tangible, supposedly, in the more subtle non-physical realms. The physical realm as such is that they can be brought out, played out, and seen and released. You live out the drama, and you're done with it, and that is the gain in energy. There's a huge freeing up in energy there. But this is, for what it's worth, I tend to think there's an awful lot of truth in that way. That the energy comes from the playing out of the scenario and it losing its appeal. I've done the marriage scenario, and various scenarios, and you go through them, see it from alpha through omega, and you just release it. And so in one sense, I could look at my life or what it seems like with your life. It seems to lurch from maybe disaster to disaster. Yeah, on one level, yeah, from that kind of ego level, yeah, that might be the case. But from a level of consciousness, what you're doing is quickly working through various patterns that are there that otherwise would just go completely undetected and straps you to the wheel of life. You have to come back again and again and again. And I suppose, because I have to go now, just try and tie it up a bit, is that we both started this conversation with a very vivid sense that life in this world is just going to get an awful lot harder, at a minimum over centuries. So really the options available for the manifestation of consciousness really diminish from here on out. It could well be, we're in some subtle realm in the 2040s, 2050s, and we've the delightful prospect of being some sort of factory monkey in Calcutta. Leading very oppressed and closed off life with next to no opportunity for, the free manifestation of what's contained in your awareness.
Or if civilization completely collapses in the short term, everything could become new again and enormously stimulating. If there's a zombie apocalypse, I've always wanted to experience a zombie apocalypse. It would be enormously stimulating.
Yeah, well,
travel around, from place to place. And what am I going to eat next? And, lots of fun.
Well, I'll give you another one. It's, we mentioned Chomsky. I remember Chomsky once saying, he said a friend of his had survived, the Jewish friend of his survived the Warsaw Uprising. And he'd been in the Polish underground in the 1940s. And someone said to him, oh, how perfectly awful. And he said, no, best time of my life. Best time of my life. All right, listen, I'm going to let you go. Good chat.
Good. All right.
Yep.
Likewise. Till next time.
Sure. And look, I mean, I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning fucking blown away that I should remember what I was speaking about the night before. It was always a kind of, I will admit, it provided me with gentle relief when I got your email the other evening suggesting another conversation, which said to me, well, I couldn't have been that bad.
No, it's always good. It's always good.
Sure. All right. Well, good luck. We'll talk soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay.